Well, I had just gotten out of graduate school where I did thesis work in experimental nuclear physics and took a job in technical intelligence. And my boss gave me a book, Journeys Out of the Body, which was written by Robert A. Monroe. So my boss hands me the book and says, "Tom, read this. I want to know what you think." Because I'm just a fresh physicist, just out of school. And I read it, and what I told my boss was, well, if this guy's just making it up, and trying to sell books, then he's got a good imagination. If it's real, then that means there's a whole lot of reality out there that's structured and can be understood that I don't know anything about, and that's exciting. But how would you ever know? How do you know which one of those it is? Well, a couple of months went by, and it turns out that my boss and others found out where this Robert A. Monroe lived, and he wasn't that far away from where we worked, from where we lived. So a plan was made to go out and meet him. And I was anxious to go because I wanted to know, as I say in my book, was this guy nuts or what? So we go out there, and I met Bob Monroe, wealthy businessman. He was very straightforward. His personality was more like an engineer than anything else. He was to the point and very focused, intelligent, and he had had these out-of-body experiences. They scared him half to death. He tried not to have them, but he had them anyway. It wasn't something he wanted to do or tried to do. He was probably more like in his late 40s when it first happened to him. Yes. He didn't write the book until later, but he was probably in his late 40s when this happened, maybe early 50s. And he was very straightforward. He obviously had enough money that he didn't need to sell books. He had just built a lab to study consciousness because this happened to him. He knew it was real because he had worked with it, he had experimented with it, he had tested it, and he was able to convince himself it was real because he could interact with real things and make a difference and get information that he could check. So personally, to him, there was no question it was real. But he knew it was a hard sell for anybody else to believe, so he wanted to do this lab so that we could understand it and turn it into science. That was his dream, make this so that it's not, what do they call it now? Woo-woo. That wasn't a woo-woo science, but it was real science is what he wanted. So I just happened to be there and being a young scientist, and another fellow that I worked with, he was an electrical engineer. So we volunteered that we would be staff his lab, and we would build equipment for measuring body functions and GSR, EEG, that kind of stuff, if he would teach us what he knew about going out of body. That was our plan, And Dennis Menerick was the guy's name, and he and I talked, and neither one of us was too sure that this was going to be a real thing. So we both kind of talked and said, well, if this turns out to be just, foolishness, then we can always leave. We're not stuck here. So we said, sure, we'll do it. And that started the two of us going out to meet with Bob Monroe, and we would spend a couple of hours building equipment, doing other things, and experiments. And then at the end, after we were done, he'd come up and we'd spend another hour or so with him teaching us how to experience this larger consciousness system. Yes, so he was able to teach us this, and within a year and a half, Dennis and I were accumulating evidence, just as Bob had, that this was real, and he taught us how to go out of body. At least that's the term. Out of body is just a metaphor. But he taught us to do that at will, when we wanted to. And we, of course, first needed to do things that we could check. Because if you just go out and do something, totally outside of this reality, then there's no way to tell whether that was real or is that your imagination. Yes, basically we were in booths that were isolated. They were surrounded by sheet metal that was grounded, so there was no electric fields. They were soundproofed, and there were 3 booths in a row, and I was in the first one and Dennis was in the last one, so there was an empty booth between us. There was a microphone hanging from the ceiling just inches away from our lips, and we had GSR, which is galvanic skin response, on our fingers, and that was about all that was in the lab at that time. So we would each go in our chamber that was, like I say, soundproof. We could not hear each other, and we could talk over the microphone, and Bob was in the control room and he could hear both of us. And then he would give us instructions, how to relax, what to do. He taught us to do what he had done, I guess, to end up going out of body. He does have a very, very good voice. And then he would record everything. So he trained us to be able to go out of body and talk about it while we were there. So we could, it's a little difficult to do at first, but once you learn that skill, then you can be in some of the reality frame, but still move your mouth and lips and vocal cords and report to him what you're experiencing. Yeah, well, out of body's a misnomer. You don't go out of your body. That's a term that Bob gave to it, and it represents some beliefs that go back, 70, 80 years ago about, the soul being in the body, or what do they call it, an astral body, being in the body and it leaves the body, and it doesn't work like that at all. But that's the term, going out of body. We did learn how to go out of body, and we immediately worked only on things that were evidential, which means basically remote viewing. We'd go places and we'd be given coordinates or some other sort of thing, and then we would say what was there, and then we check it to see what was there. We worked some on healing, some on reading numbers written in a blackboard in another room, of course written on the blackboard after we were in the booths. Bob could talk to each of us individually or both of us at once, so we were isolated completely, but Bob could hear us both. Yeah, those recordings still, you can find them on the web, on the internet. They're still there. The old, we were called Explorers, the old Explorer tapes, and they were taken on cheap cassette tapes.
This is Robert Monroe speaking. The following is made up of material taken directly from the voice tracks of Explorer sessions held here at our research facility. We offer them without our evaluation or comment, so that you can learn from them as we did, and form your own interpretation or analysis of what took place.
Yeah, we learned this, and my job, being a physicist, was to try to understand how did it work, because that's what physicists do. A physicist models reality. That's kind of the definition of physics, if you will. We look at reality, try to come up with models that explain how it works. So I was supposed to come up with models to explain how this worked, and I worked on that a real long time, because I quickly found out that I could get information that I shouldn't have under any normal means, and statistically, Dennis and I had done these things over and over again, to where we had one in 50,000 that what we were getting could just be good luck. That's called statistical significance, and it was very significant. So we knew intellectually that we were somehow getting information that should not have been available to us under any normal means. But you still have an emotional problem with it. Both of us did. When somebody would ask us, well, you really gone out of body? We'd say, well, I don't know. We're doing some really strange stuff. We're getting a lot of good data, but it was kind of it's hard to say yes, because that was such a dramatic thing for us. And we're both scientists, so it's like, it sounds like it, seems like it, probably. But we don't really know how it works. We don't know anything about it, so we're not really all that sure of what we're doing. We're doing it because we followed Bob's instructions. But exactly how we were doing it or what was going on, we really didn't know yet, so we weren't all that comfortable. One experiment that Bob gave Dennis and I was to go out of body together. Just something that Bob thought of would be an interesting experiment to try, because we'd tried lots of different experiments to see, to collect evidence, because he knew that we had to, come to the realization that it was real on our own from our own experience. Just him telling us that wasn't sufficient. So this experiment, Dennis and I were to leave our bodies. We were to go up above the lab, in the air, up above the roof, connect with each other, and then go off and have some experience anywhere we wanted to. It was open to us to do whatever. So we did that. And we were probably 2 hours in that experience. And we met people, had conversations, saw things, we talked to each other a lot, and so on. Now, this talking to each other wasn't actual. I never heard anything that Dennis said. He never heard anything that I said. We were in soundproof rooms, and Bob had us on separate channels, and we never were on the same channel. So we were disconnected from each other, both electromagnetically and acoustically. Anyway, at the end of all of that, we got out of our beds and kind of staggered up to the control room, and Bob was real, had a big grin on his face, and he said, "Well, do you guys think you were together?" We kind of looked at each other, and I said, "Well, it seemed like it," and Dennis said the same thing. So he said, "Well, listen to this," and he flipped the two tape recorders to play at the same time. So there Dennis and I were talking to each other, answering each other's questions, seeing the same thing, and it was obvious that we were together, we were in other reality frames, and we were experiencing the same things. It was like I say, we talked to entities, we had conversations, we saw places, buildings.
So for you, it was like?
For us, it was like this. It was like this bush. It was physical, and we were describing it, and we would point things out to each other. "Oh, do you see that?" It was like this. We would see something, and Bob would ask us a question. "Well, what is that in front of you, or what's off to your left?" Because Dennis may have already said something, you see, so he'd give that to me. So then I'd look and I'd tell him what I saw. And then, I would talk to Dennis in the out-of-body state. And in the out-of-body, of course, I'm not using my voice then. Talking to Dennis in the out-of-body state, it's all telepathic. We're both out of body. So it's maybe a little confusing to your listeners here. But when I say I was talking with Dennis, then we were talking to Dennis telepathically and out of body. And we would talk to each other. "Did you see that?" or whatever. So we're not talking to each other through the headsets. Anyway, we got back, and here was this thing. We were obviously both there together. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because I'm very skeptical, like a scientist should be. And I wasn't quite ready to admit yet that what we were doing was real until that happened. And for me, there was no other explanation other than we were in another reality frame together. Dean Radin has a nice little thing he says. He says, "Science is not about proof." He says, "Proof is for whiskey." He says, "Science is about evidence." And that's true. This was kind of the last straw as far as the evidence. I had a lot of evidence, but I'd only accepted that at an intellectual level. This I accepted at an emotional level. This was the last straw for that. So there was no other explanation that, other than the fact that we were together in another reality, experiencing something, and we had done it together, so it couldn't be my hallucination, and his hallucination couldn't be interactive like that if we were hallucinating. You see, the only way that we could be interactive like that is if it were actual. We were there, having the experience. Otherwise, you could say, well, it was your imagination. Well, we can't have each of our imaginations interacting with each other. See the point? There's no way out of that. There's no, it was a hallucination, it was your imagination, etc. In this one, because that couldn't happen and still have this interaction. So that's why I was kind of trapped emotionally to say, yes, this is real. And that was a major thing for me. After that, I didn't ask the question very much, is this real? I just asked the question, what's going on here? What are we doing? Why are we experiencing this phenomena? And I spent the next probably 35 years trying to answer those questions. And eventually, I thought I understood it well enough and had a theory together that explained all the data points that I started writing books. And that's the My Big Toe trilogy of books. That was published in 2002, in February. And since then, of course, I've learned more. And one of the interesting things is that I wrote those books as an explanation of consciousness. It was a theory of consciousness, and that's what they were about. After I was done with them, had them published, they'd been out probably about a year or so, I realized that the very same concepts, the very same logic that explained consciousness also explained physics. And I didn't write them to explain physics, but they did. And then I realized, well, look at this. This logic explains the double slit experiment. This logic explains why speed of light is a constant. These are two big problems in physics. One of them, the double slit experiment, ends up with the conclusion that particles aren't really particles, really massive particles. They're probability distributions, because unless you consider them to be probability distributions, you can't calculate any right answers. But if you consider them to be probability distributions, then you can predict what these particles are going to do. But nobody had an idea why they should be probability distributions. With the speed of light, that's the basis of relativity. So the two big things in science had these problems of explanation in them. The probability distributions, totally unknown. We just know if we use it, it works. And in relativity, it was, why is the speed of light a constant? Everything else in our reality, it's the speed with which it moves is relative to the speed with which the platform that it's on moves. In other words, if you're in a car that's going 10 miles an hour and you reach out the window with a ball and throw it in the forward direction of the car 10 miles an hour, the ball is going 20 miles an hour because it's got 10 from the car and 10 from your throw. They're additive. Light isn't like that. It doesn't matter how fast the platform is, where the light source is, light always travels the same velocity. Nothing else in the universe does that. And it's a big mystery. Why should that be that way? Well, I realized that my theory of consciousness explained both of those things. Then I started thinking a little more about it, and it explained lots of other scientific problems. We have a scientific problem with the universe is expanding. It's not only expanding, the expansion is accelerating. And the question is, well, if our universe is all the reality that there is, this universe is all reality, then what is it that we're expanding into? How do we expand into nothing? Where does all the extra space come from? What's manufacturing the extra space that fills up the bigger volume as it grows? And there's lots of these kinds of questions that can't be answered. And there's questions like, where does mass, charge, space, time, spin, gravity, where do these things come from? These are all fundamental things in physics. And all of physics is based on understanding the interactions of them. But all of these fundamental things have no source. They have no causal connection. They have no causal chain. What makes mass? What makes charge? Well, we can break charge down. We can say an electron's charge comes from quarks. But what makes charge on quarks? You say, well, nobody knows. So the most fundamental things in physics have no causal chain. They just are. Same with the Big Bang. Where did that ball of plasma come from that went bang? And then evolution of the universe will tell you about how that plasma expanded it cooled, suns formed, planets formed, and we end up with our solar system and us and so on, and it just evolved out of this universe. But where did that ball of plasma come from? Certainly didn't come from our universe, because our universe didn't exist. And why was that ball of plasma just sitting there with all that temperature and pressure, and how did it get there, and what was containing all of that? Because then at T equals 0, it explodes, bang, right? It expands because it's very high pressure, very high temperature. But how did it just get there and sit there and wait for T to be 0, you see? So we have all these problems in physics, all these paradoxes that just don't have answers. And this theory of consciousness answered every one of them logically and with no added hard problems, no added assumptions. There's just two assumptions in it: consciousness exists and evolution exists. Everything else is a logical derivation. So I was surprised. You know, I'm a physicist. If I hadn't been a physicist, I wouldn't have noticed the connections. But I noticed the connections, and it surprised me. And then I started to think about more of it, things like tunneling, lots of these paradoxes in physics, and it could answer all of them. And then I started to realize that it answered other kinds of paradoxes too. Paradoxes in philosophy. You know, why are we here? What's the meaning of life? What's the point of this universe? You know, does it have a purpose? Do we have a purpose, or is it all just random stuff and we just happen to be here and there is no purpose? What's the cause of time? Where does time come from? It's another one of these basic things that, well, it just is. So it turned out that science is based on a lot of things that we don't understand at the root of it, which doesn't really give you a warm feeling about, you know, what we end up with. If at the roots it's like, we don't know, it just exists, then maybe a lot of the rest of the conclusions we're going to are suspect as well. So that's kind of how, you know, that's kind of how a nice physicist like me ended up in a place like this, you know, talking about consciousness and the larger reality frame. So I did get an understanding of it, and it does work, and it connects all the dots. As far as I know, I keep looking for dots that are disconnected, and every once in a while, somebody will point something out like that, and if I think about it a little bit, then I see how it just fits right into the theory. The nice thing is that it's simple. It's not that difficult. Now, it takes a long time to derive all this logically. We'd need to talk for probably 8 or 10 hours for me to give you logical derivations of this. But once you get it, and that's only because it would take you that long to get through the paradigm shifts that are required. Once you get through the paradigm shifts, everything becomes simple. It's really easy. But major paradigm shifts are not easy. You really have to lead people slowly through the logical process before the paradigm shift becomes apparent. Yes, well, just from our culture, we learned that physical reality is fundamental. Everything else is derivative from physical reality. Nobody set us down and made us memorize that, but we all just get that that's the way it is, and it's very hard to think in any other terms. It turns out that reality is not, our physical reality is not fundamental, that our physical reality is virtual. And back in 2002, when these were published, myself and Dr. Edward Fredkin, another physicist, and a few other people were about the only ones that I could find anywhere on the internet that thought virtual reality was a good idea, was correct. That was just a little more than a decade ago. Today, virtual reality, and by that I mean that our universe is based on information. It's information-based. It's calculated. That means it's a simulation. That means it's a virtual reality. So that's what we mean by virtual reality. It's a computed universe, and information is really at the base of it all. It's like a game. It's like World of Warcraft or The Sims. It's a virtual reality game. Well, if you have a game, you need to have a purpose. You don't just make a game for no reason. And you have to have, a process that works the game. And my theory of consciousness then explains the game and how it came to be, why it had to be the way it is, because it's not just that I make up this thing about a game, but I start with my two assumptions of consciousness and evolution. Everything else is, like I say, it's a logical derivation. So the purpose of the game has to be, this purpose, otherwise the whole logic, doesn't work. And the process has to be the way it is because it's just the outcome of a logical process. So none of this is introducing any new strange assumptions, no new hard problems, no new paradoxes are created. It just basically answers the mail. So that's sort of what I've done and where I came from, why I'm talking about virtual reality. And I've just finished with a workshop here. Had about 80 people in it, something like that. And most people come in with the idea, this is really weird, this is strange, but I'm interested. Because they're interested in the nature of reality and how reality works and what's their part in it and what they should do to play the game better. And usually by the time I get to the end, and I'm mainly telling them logical process, almost everybody gets it. So it's not that hard. You don't need a degree in science to get this. And that makes sense to me because if you really understand a fundamental solution, you should be able to explain it to anybody. Any reasonably intelligent person ought to be able to get it. If you need to be a mathematician or a physicist, if you need 5 pages of mathematics to explain it, then it's probably not fundamental. I mean, it may still be true, but it's not fundamental. Fundamental things have to be straightforward. They have to be rather simple because they're big conceptual things at the fundamental level. Now, these fundamentals can go together and make all kinds of complicated stuff that needs 4 pages of mathematics to explain it. But the very fundamental things at the beginning are straightforward, simple, basic things. And they're not that hard to get once you can get the paradigm shifts. The big paradigm shift is that this is a virtual reality. Today, probably 20-30% of the physicists think that's a good idea because their experiments are forcing them to think that's a good idea. They do experiments now at the CERN experiment where they were, looking at the hadron, what do they call it, the God particle, Higgs boson. They were looking at the Higgs boson. And you can go to YouTube and listen to some of these scientists talk because a lot of them were interviewed because the Higgs was a real big deal, about a year back or so. A lot of news, a lot of interviews.
Validates quantum physics.
Yeah, and what you'll hear them saying is things like, we used to think of an electron as a piece of mass with charge, but we don't talk about it like that anymore. Now we talk about an electron as a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge. Well, if you're going to simulate an electron in a computer, you simulate it as a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge. They're having to approach physics as a virtual reality. It's based on information, attributes of information, not on a materialistic viewpoint of mass and space and so on. Space is a computation. And you find out, when you look at quantum mechanics, you realize that the fundamental thing at the root there that makes the difference, it's information. Information's the key. So modern physics experiments are dragging the theory into virtual reality. That's where the answers are. That's what you have to understand if you're going to understand the results of the experiments. So it's gone from nobody takes it seriously to a real serious concept within physics departments everywhere. See, so that's good. That's good for me, because that is the way this reality works. So, given that this is a virtual reality, let's start with that assumption just for this discussion, that it is a virtual reality. Then all virtual realities work in the same way, have the same structure. Now there are differences between them, but the fundamental structure of a virtual reality is this. And I'll use the World of Warcraft video game as a way to talk about it. In the World of Warcraft video game, there's two things that are important to notice. One is that there are three components. One component is the computer. There's a computer that's computing the virtual reality. The second component is the virtual reality itself. That's the computed reality, and that's on a hard drive. It's a dynamic reality, but it's just data, information on the hard drive. And then the third component is the player. Virtual reality requires a computer and a player. And in fact, the computer and player are the only two active parts. So the computer creates the virtual reality, and the player looks at the data. It sends that data to the player. The player displays it and interprets it. And in this case, World of Warcraft, there's a bunch of pixels. The player looks at the pixels, interprets what that means, and then the player makes choices. The player decides to make its elf, run or stay or fight or whatever. The player sends those choices back to the computer. The computer implements them in the visuals that it's computing, so the elf runs or fights or whatever it's told to do, and sends that data back to the player to show him what has happened. The player makes more choices. So it's really an interchange of data between the player and the computer. The virtual reality itself is just information on a hard drive someplace that keeps getting updated, every so often. So the second thing to know about this is that both the computer and the player cannot be inside the virtual reality that's being computed. Okay, now what that means is that the elf in the World of Warcraft, the World of Warcraft map or world is his reality frame. That's the World of Warcraft reality frame. The computer cannot be inside that reality frame because a simulation cannot simulate itself. So the elf is never going to look around in the World of Warcraft reality frame and find the computer that's computing it. To the elf, the computer is non-physical. To the elf, the World of Warcraft map is physical. If the elf runs into a tree, he bounces off. He has to open doors and walk through them. He doesn't walk through walls, so he lives in a physical reality. The computer is non-physical to him.
And the player?
Yeah, and the player is non-physical to him in exactly the same way. The computer and the player have to be in the same reality frame because they're exchanging data. The player is the person with the keyboard and the joystick and the monitor who's playing the elf. The elf is their avatar, and the player is the one making the decisions. The elf itself makes no decisions. It's just data on a hard drive someplace. It's a virtual reality. The player is that virtual avatar's consciousness. Okay, so the player serves the function of the consciousness for the elf. So the elf just sits there and does nothing until the player makes a choice. Run, stay, fight, jump, dance, whatever it is. The elf does that when its consciousness, the player, tells it to do that. But what's going on is an exchange between the player and the computer. Both the player and the computer have to be in the same reality frame because you don't exchange data directly across reality frames. Different reality, the data doesn't flow. That's what reality means. You're contained. Right. So you see, we just made the point that in any virtual reality, this is the way it has to be. This is not just World of Warcraft. This is a fundamental nature of a virtual reality, that within the reality, from the viewpoint from inside the reality. Both the player, which is the consciousness controlling the avatar, and the computer are non-physical. They exist in some other reality frame, and that other reality frame is the same for both. They both exist in this other reality frame. Now, the other thing is that consciousness is information. That might strike people as strange, but if you think about what are you conscious of? What is your consciousness? It's your awareness. How do you have awareness? You get data from your senses. You get auditory data, you get visual data, you get smell data, you get touch data, you get all this data from your senses, and you take that data and interpret it to be something, just like the player interprets all the pixels on this flat screen in front of him to be that reality. We take all that data from our senses and interpret it to be this physical reality. We. Now we have to define who is this we. Okay, now let's get to this reality. If, like physics is telling us now, that reality is virtual, then this, what we see as physical, is only information on a computer. That's what they're saying. It seems to be information-based, and that our consciousness is in another reality frame other than this one. And the computer is also in that same reality frame that's other than this one. Well, we know that consciousness is about information. It's information processing, taking in information and then interpreting it into be a reality. We know that computers are information processors because we know that's what computers do. They're both in the same reality, and it makes sense then that the computer and the consciousness are connected somehow. Well, yeah, they're communicating, right? They have to be connected, they're communicating. So yes, so you see, consciousness is the player. And when you're the player in World of Warcraft, you are the elf's consciousness. Consciousness can't be on a hard drive. That doesn't make any sense. Consciousness makes choices. Data on a hard drive doesn't make choices. Consciousness has to be some other reality frame. So it's easy to see in the World of Warcraft that the consciousness and the computer are in the same reality frame, and that the elf is in a frame that the elf finds to be physical, and the elf is just a information. It's just information on a hard drive. Okay, so that makes sense, but now we extrapolate that to our reality. Okay, here we are in this physical universe. It's just a virtual reality. What does that mean? That means our consciousness is in another reality frame that is non-physical to us. That the computer is in another frame that's non-physical to us, and that they're both in the same frame. They're both information processors. So we think then that this other reality frame is what I call the larger consciousness system. It's a digital information system, and part of that digital information system serves as the computer. Another part of that digital information system serves as the consciousness. Okay?
So the player.
As the player, right. Serves as the player of the game.